Good afternoon, my beautiful babes and babettes. I am your resident active advocate, here to talk to you today about Peter Pan and disability. Again, this will be addressing the Disney version of this story, though, as I said yesterday, there are a multitude of different versions of this story. I could very easily talk about Captain Hook and his hand, as I mentioned at the end of yesterday's video, but that's low-hanging fruit for me, and I would instead like to talk about the mental health aspects of disability that are present in this movie. There are two separate cases to discuss in regards to this. There's Captain Hook and post-traumatic stress disorder, and there's Peter Pan and the mental health disorder that was literally named after this character, Peter Pan syndrome. Let's start with Hook. Captain Hook, after having his hand sliced off by Peter Pan and having his hand thrown to a crocodile, is being pursued by this crocodile who has a taste for the rest of him now. Captain Hook, having gone through having a limb chopped off, exhibits post-traumatic stress disorder. And what is involved in PTSD is that a person will start to display, after having a traumatic experience, symptoms of paranoia, of anxiety, often of flashbacks, sometimes even of chronic depression and of sleep deprivation. So Hook exhibits many of these symptoms and is always yelling at his first mate Smee, get this boat moving, we have to get away from the crocodile. He's so afraid of this crocodile that even though he's a bloodthirsty pirate with loads and loads of lackeys at his service, he doesn't turn the ship around and actually face up to the crocodile. Although it is more than implied that all of his men can fight, and you see that Hook definitely can. He can fight with a sword. And it's not that he dislikes the Hook. He likes the Hook. It's part of his identity now, which I think is an identity positive thing. But the fact that this crocodile is pursuing him in order to eat the rest of him is the cause of his stress, and the fact that he had his hand chopped off in the first place caused him PTSD, which is then followed up by the crocodile pursuing him, which of course leaves him in a constant state of paranoia. When is this thing going to find me? When is this thing going to eat me? Is anyone going to be able to protect me? Am I going to be able to protect myself? If you think outside the box, he definitely could, because as I say, he could fight. He could fight back, he can kill this thing pretty easily. But that's not really the whole conceit of his plotline. His plotline is that he's always running from something. And one of the interesting aspects of the crocodile is that it has a ticking clock inside of its stomach. It somehow ended up swallowing a clock, and that clock is perceived by Hook, and I'm spinning my finger around like the hand on the clock. The clock is perceived by Hook as pretty much counting the seconds down to his death, if he were to be caught by this crocodile and eaten, right? So Hook is definitely a candidate for PTSD, also for a chronic anxiety disorder, and he's not able to fight intellectually or mentally, even though physically he probably could. On the reverse side of this is Peter Pan, who, as I said, exhibits Peter Pan syndrome, literally, which was named after him. And I don't know whether this syndrome was diagnosable before or after this movie came out. The book, of course, came out much, much earlier, and was part of J.M. Barrie's collection of short stories and plays for children. So with Peter Pan, I honestly believe this disorder to be much worse than Hook's PTSD. The symptoms of Peter Pan disorder are that a person is intellectually and emotionally stunted into childhood. I'm not entirely sure how this happens in the real world. In the story itself, though, he is literally a boy who cannot grow up. It's not that he refuses to grow up, it's that he literally cannot grow up, so long as he stays in Neverland. So Neverland becomes his childhood safety place, right? And we all have memories of, the home that we lived in as a child and how supportive and loving and, all of those sorts of things seemed when we were children. Our environment, our parents, our friends, everything was easy. Everything was fun. If you grew up, let me put this in as a caveat, if you grew up in a happy home and with good friends who, supported you and liked you. I realize that that is not universally the case, absolutely not. And a lot of the time, though, Peter Pan syndrome comes as a lack of resources to be able to grow up. And by that, I mean intellectually and emotionally speaking. One will see childhood, if they had a good childhood, as the happy place, as the safe place. And people with this disorder cannot find it in themselves to leave that place intellectually or emotionally. But there are caveats to this. It's not the same as having a youthful spirit. It's not the same as staying young at heart. That's a different thing. Peter Pan syndrome is also sort of exemplified in a lack of morality in the person. I am not saying that Peter Pan is an immoral character. He's not necessarily an immoral character. He is amoral. On the spectrum here, there's morality, which is what is good, what is right. There is immorality, which is what is wrong, what is hurtful. And there is amorality, which is a lack of distinction between the two. In his case, the inability to distinguish between the two. He's very rude to a lot of the people around him, very condescending, very demanding. He can be extraordinarily cruel. He's very cruel to both Wendy and Hook. Obviously, he's cruel to Hook. But what distinguishes Peter as an amoral agent, not an immoral agent, is that he does not understand fundamentally that what he's doing is wrong. He lacks the capacity to understand at all, especially when it comes to Hook. When he's sword fighting with Hook, he treats the whole thing as a game. He's putting his own life on the line, the lives of his friends, the life of his supposed enemy. He's putting all of that on the line and treating it as a game. Hook, however, as an adult, does not see this as a game, and he's the one who got his hand chopped off, so no wonder. But Peter sees everything in his environment as a kind of toy or a kind of agent to serve his needs and to serve his desire to stay within the realm of childhood forever. That is a primary distinguishing feature of Peter Pan syndrome in the real world as well. You cannot tell the difference between right and wrong. You don't understand it because mentally and emotionally you have not evolved the capacity to understand between right and wrong. You don't know the difference. And that is a trait that is found in very young humans much of the time. As we age, as we grow, we tend to develop a tendency towards empathy and towards being able to understand where another person sits and where they are coming from with their perspective. If we do not develop empathy, I am of the opinion that it is very difficult to grow up, but also that it is very difficult if you do grow up to be a, quote, nice person. Because oftentimes, if you lack empathy, you will take advantage of the people around you. And you might not know that it's wrong. People who don't have Peter Pan syndrome, but who also don't have empathy, that could be branded as a form of sociopathy, because they could understand that what they do is wrong in taking advantage of people, as Peter does to all of his friends. He takes advantage of them and uses them for his own means. They're all part of the game to him. But for people in the real world who do know the difference between right and wrong, because they have intellectually matured enough to know that, but have not correspondingly emotionally matured up to that level, they could be classified as sociopathic, but that is a huge spectrum term, right? And not everyone who lacks empathy is necessarily a sociopath, okay? That's not what I'm saying. I'm also not a psychologist, so I don't feel fully qualified to diagnose anything of that nature. Generally, sociopathy is characterized with a lack of empathy, but not always. There are other factors at play with disorders of that nature. Peter Pan syndrome, though, is necessarily not sociopathic, because there is also no intellectual growth. One stays either because of one's will or against one's will in a state of perpetual intellectual and emotional childhood. As I say, this could be brought on by the fear of growing up, but it may also be brought on by just an ordinary disorder in the brain that doesn't allow it to fully develop into the state of adulthood. There are a lot of people who don't want to grow up, but who are still there emotionally and intellectually, but they want to go back to how they were as children, back to that time of, what they perceive as happiness, innocence, simplicity. And that is also a very common symptom of depression, when you are not able to cope with the real life issues that are surrounding you. Necessarily, you might want to go back to a time when there were fewer issues surrounding you in your life. And that makes perfect sense. That's actually a very emotionally cognizant response to what's going on with you, because or you feel that you can't handle it, but that's not necessarily the case. Not everyone with depression has Peter Pan syndrome. Not everyone with Peter Pan syndrome has depression, okay? These are not comorbid with one another. But people with depression, too, may seek to go back into that time of innocence when they weren't suffering in the way they are now. And especially in the case of chronic depression or drug-resistant depression, I know a few people like this. And for them, life can be very difficult because they are aware of the fact that they can't go back. And that can be a very bitter pill to swallow for a lot of people. And especially nowadays, when, because of our happy little friend hanging out in the atmosphere, please, for the love of the gods, get your vaccination. Because of our little friend, we are all isolated from one another, and humans need other humans. It doesn't matter how introverted you are. Everyone needs human interaction. Everyone. So the fact that we can't get out right now drives a lot of people to seek comfort in more childhood-based things, shall we say. You see people playing video games much more, consuming much more media, comfort food, comfort objects, the sorts of things I've heard that we're spending our money on right now, as opposed to like travel and going to the movies and hanging out with friends and going to restaurants and that sort of thing. A lot of it has to do with emotional care and self-care, so mental and physical. But that comes as a result of being stuck at home a lot of the time, or even most of the time. But with that also comes a lack of responsibility. And Peter Pan in the movie has no responsibilities whatsoever. He refuses to give himself responsibilities. He refuses to be given responsibilities. Because even as the leader of the Lost Boys, as I say, he just sees it as one big game. And that is not how an adult mind works. If you are adult in your thinking, and if you are put into a position of leadership, results can vary, but you will still understand that, this is a responsible thing you are doing rather than some kind of a game. And that is a much more mature response as opposed to Peter, where it's like, let's play a game of follow the leader, let's play a game of hunt the pirate, these sorts of things. And as I said earlier, he doesn't care whether he's putting himself or others in danger, so long as the game continues, and so long as he never has to grow up, because that's his number one fear. And that is the number one fear of anyone with Peter Pan syndrome, so far as I understand it. This is a very rare disorder, even though it has traits that can be comorbid with other disorders. But the full embodied thing itself is actually quite rare. It's when you do not advance both emotionally and intellectually into the state of adulthood. Even though your body grows up, your mind does not. This is not, by the way, the same as intellectual disability, where one's brain has not formed, quote, normally, in which case one is, I don't want to say forced, but held by their body in a state of intellectual childhood. It's not quite the same thing. It could be a combination of things. It could be, trauma. It could be choice. It could be depression, as I say. It could be any number of things that drives a person inside themselves for them to say, no, I will not grow up. I will not take responsibility. And as I say, this can be a cover for mental trauma and emotional trauma. And that is as far as a person will be willing to allow themselves to go. With intellectual disability, at least of the kind where a person is, quote, stunted at a certain age, it's not the same thing because it's not by choice. It's not even by a combination of factors. It will most often be congenital, so born with it or acquired before the age of 4. That's the definition of congenital. Peter Pan syndrome is not necessarily that way. All right, so for as complex as this is, I hope I've been able to illuminate Peter's character a little more for you. And if you want to watch this movie again, I still don't recommend it because of everything I said yesterday. Watching for the psychological aspect is actually quite interesting. Watching for pretty much any other reason, I don't know. I cannot, will not tell my audience what to do. I just don't recommend it for any political narrative, because it's bad. It's bad. And that is my say about that. So, I can't remember what movie is up tomorrow. I believe it's Sleeping Beauty. I will check my list again. There's this big master list of Disney movies that I found online, and they're in chronological order, which I love. So, it might be Sleeping Beauty. I think it is. And yes, there is a disability narrative in that movie, which we will discuss. Actually, there's more than one. But, if it's not Sleeping Beauty, I'll give you whatever it is. I can't remember. And I will see all y'all lovely people tomorrow. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Mwah!